Good morning. My name is Pedro Marques and I work at Juniper Contrail Group. And first of all, thank you very much for coming here. I'd like to spend some time talking to you about the Contrail product and specifically how some of our customers are using it. Mostly I'll go through a demo. I have just some slides to guide me as a script, which I'll introduce, but most of the conversation will be a demo, and please make it as interactive as possible. Hopefully I'll manage to convey the message that I have to tell you today. So let's see if I can find my file. Okay, so how does this work? Essentially, what I'd like to talk to you today is how some of our customers, and this is starting to be one of the most common use cases for Contrail, how are our customers using network virtualization in OpenStack, and specifically using the Contrail product to be able to essentially do what they need to do in terms of hosting applications. One sort of significant group of our customers, you can think of them as SaaS providers, so people that host complex application stacks. And if you look at application hosting, very often what the consumer sees as a single app is actually composed of many tiers. You typically have your front ends, there's for sure a database layer, there's a cache layer somewhere. Commonly, each tier of an application is managed by a different group. So as you can imagine, there's going to be a group that is responsible for managing databases, and a database service will need to serve multiple user-visible applications. For a user-visible application, there'll be different teams managing application A versus application B. So a very common theme within this SaaS providers is that there's a lot of common services that are managed as a service inside the data center. And I have a small example that I've concoded, and I want to go through it. What I have a database service and a logging service, and this is just an example. As you can imagine, I don't have the ability to stand up a real professional database backend. In the context of a lot of these hosting providers, application providers, you have different groups, and one of the groups that's key here is the SecOps group, which must be able to define access policies for data that is flowing between a tier, which is considered a client, and a service, for instance, databases. Very often, SecOps wants to be able to limit the TCP ports and/or roll in a firewall on demand if they believe that there's the reason to do deeper packet inspection. So throughout my demo, I have a test cluster that I'm using, which has 5 bare metal servers. I'm using 2 of those servers to serve as OpenStack controllers. OpenStack and OpenContrail are running on active-active, and I have 3 compute nodes on those servers. They just happen to be on the same rack, but it actually doesn't matter. The only thing that our setup assumes is that there's IP connectivity between those servers, and that there's IP connectivity between those servers and a data center gateway. As data center gateways, we're using a pair of Juniper MXs, but we could use any L3VPN capable router as an interconnect. I'm going to try to change to the view of our management system So our management system happens to give you a similar information. So there are 3 compute nodes here, and then there's functionality that is running across 2 bare metal servers where we're running all of the components of the Contrail software as active. Inside Contrail we have sort of 3 tiers, and all the tiers, which is configuration, control, and analytics tiers, and all those tiers are horizontally scalable. So they show up as a count of 6, but they are actually living on only 2 physical servers. So if I manage to go back to my slides, so I'd like to guide you through an example of, and this example is a front-end application. I just took Redmine as a web, an app out of the web, and I split it such that it's using MySQL backend being managed by a different OpenStack tenant, and is using logging. It's just using syslog being managed by a different tenant. Logging is the kind of service that you typically centralize in a large-scale operation, and is also using access to a management server, which you can think of as a jump host, and it's typically the host that I use to access the virtual network domain and then be able to manage my computers, so my virtual machine. So each of them has been set up as an independent project in OpenStack, because again, in a reasonably complex organization, these are different admin authorities. So let me just see if I can jump back again to my existing cluster, and I'm logged in currently as admin, and as admin I have an example that is currently running of this setup, where I have a Redmine application here. I don't know if you can see my highlight. I guess you can. Redmine is talking to a DB backend, that's this guy, that's being managed by a different project, and you can see that to each project corresponds a different /24. There's a management server here, which I'm going to use to be able to log into my Redmine host, and log manager is the guy that is collecting syslogs. All of these are different subnets. And now for the moment of truth, whether or not I can actually talk to any of these guys. So my jump host at the moment has a floating IP address. So it has an address that exposes. Sorry. The way the Contrail works is that we can extend a virtual network from the virtualized domain outside to the non-virtualized world using BGP L3 VPN. So I have a network that's called the public network, which has a floating IP pool, and I allocated a floating IP pool to my management host, my jump host. I could have also used something like a VPN service on that host, in order to be able to jump into. So I set up this guy with, let me see if I can remember the addresses, 43.253. This is my floating IP that's sitting on a Juniper lab network, and ideally I should be able to show you that this is the case. So in the management project, I have in access and security, this is Horizon, the OpenStack UI, floating IPs 1084.42.252. That's good. It's good that I checked. Okay, so, and I think that I have root as my, it would be cumbersome if it wouldn't have worked. Okay. Okay, I managed to jump in from my laptop, which is sitting on a Juniper corporate network, through the data center gateway to the virtualized domain. So the servers are sitting on an isolated domain. The only way you go through from virtualized to non-virtualized is through these the MX gateways. And now from here, you can see that from this host perspective, the only thing that happens is it's sitting on subnet 254. But this guy can actually reach... I should put my glasses on, otherwise I'm going to end up with a headache. This guy can actually reach my Redmine application, which was 192.168.0.253. 168.0.253, and we should be able to log in and this. So in this Redmine instance, I did 2 configuration changes. I change var log var www Redmine config database YAML, and my database, my production database, now points out to 192.168.253. Now, if you notice, on this host, 253 is sitting just beyond the default route. This guy is on the /0 subnet. Okay, so from that guy's perspective, the topology looks like this. So I sort of called all the networks default, which is probably not the most demoable option. So this Redmine is sitting on this node in the center. This is the network. It's connected with Log Manager, so it can send packets to that syslog server. It's connected to my management server, so I've used the management jump host to log into it, and it's actually going through a firewall through its MySQL backend. And I'll show you in a little bit how I ended up defining that connectivity. So what's happening here is that our traffic between the Redmine front end, which is that .0 to 53, I know it's a little bit hard to follow IP addresses. So traffic between .0 to 53 to .1 to 53 on port 3306. Port 3306 is the MySQL port. This is actually being redirected by the firewall, redirected through the firewall. Now, the interesting thing about this is not so much that you can build this topology, but the question is, how do you build it, and how do you build it in a way that's manageable? So what we've done here is that the way we define the connectivity between these different services is by a concept that we call network policy. So let me give you an example of how we defined that between Redmine and a database, the traffic should go through that firewall. We did so by setting up this policy here. So if you look at this, this looks like an ACL. So protocol any from the network Redmine to the network DB, apply the firewall service. Now if I go here and I say, let me refresh, then I no longer want a service, and I say save, the traffic will now go direct host to host without going through the firewall. So if I go here and just click on something else, my firewall now, that it's still let me do clear security flow session to make sure that these sessions disappear and we no longer see it. Now I'm accessing the database. As you can imagine, every time I click on a page, this application goes to MySQL and asks for the data. Where was it? This, for instance, comes out of the data. And now there's no sessions on the firewall because I disabled that access. From here, at the moment, 192.168.1.253, I can ping that backend, right? But if I go to this policy and say that, wait a minute, I only want TCP 330 destination. Oops. Okay, good. 3306. And I say save, my ping stopped working. But hopefully my database access is still working. So, of course, the important bit here is not so much that I can do an echo, but it's going to be how do I, as a data center provider, how can I manage these services? So let me go back to edit this and go back saying that any traffic, how does any work here? Any goes through firewall. Let me see if I did this correctly. I think this firewall, oh, it's letting ping pass. Let me see. Interesting thing here, I think, and the reason we're getting a fair amount of traction with some of these application providers is essentially what's the workflow that you can get here, right? So having firewalls, everybody can do, but the question is who manages what? And the interesting bit is that I created this Redmine tenant, right? But the Redmine tenant actually doesn't manage the security policies. What it's doing is saying, I'd like to access the policy. Well, the policy is an object owned by, for instance, SecOps, or by the owner of the DB application. By the same token, that Redmine guy, the Redmine tenant is using the logger access policy, but it actually doesn't define what the rules in that policy are. It's also using the management server policy, but it doesn't define what those are. So all these policies get combined and are then applied to the traffic coming out of that Redmine virtual machine into an echo on the fly. And the interesting thing about it is, let me go back to my presentation. If you look at the typical workflow for deploying a new environment today, very often you have the tenant wants to have a new environment, staging, test, whatever. He needs to first define, whether, if you're not using OpenStack, you first define a VLAN and then ask the networking team to go off and set up that VLAN into a router and set up all the security policies, which, given that they probably don't even know, when you're managing a one single ACL, at some point in time you lose track of what the rules of the ACL R4.
You lose touch with the metadata.
You lose touch with the metadata,
The guy's
right?
configuring a firewall rule, but he doesn't know what it's configuring it for. It's just
because it's
just a source IP and a destination IP, and there's no trust, right?
Right, and there's no, you lose track of why you're doing what you're doing, right? And there's a time lag here. So a lot of what our customers are looking for is to fully automate the creation of a new environment. An environment is where they can roll out an application, whether it's in test or serving actually live traffic. So more than anything else, even if you solve the problem of keeping track of why the rules in ACL are there, there's a time lag here. Now, with the workflow that we can allow for this product, you can have SecOps define the access policies in advance, and then have the application owner, when he wants to create a new environment, say, oh gee, I need database, I need logging, I need jump host access. Let me just select the services that my environment needs, and as soon as I select those services, the network is operational, which, you know, it solves both a workflow issue and an issue of keeping track of what was that ACL there in the first place. Not only that, but then SecOps can go and say, well, gee, I really don't want ping traffic coming into the database, and I can block that. Or maybe I want to have ping traffic, and in a single place change the security policies of all the tenants that are using that service. So, you know, what I can do next is, at the moment I've showed you an instance of an environment that's working, which is my Redmine test environment. Now, what I was planning to do next is show you the steps necessary to, for instance, deploy a new similar environment. Suppose that I'm doing a staging environment for my next release of software, where I'm going to just, you know, have a new version of the application using the same database, same backend services, right? And my new version of the service, I'm going to stand it up, make sure it is working before I actually send live traffic to it. So, and I'll do that by creating a new OpenStack project, going through the steps necessary to use these services in order to show that indeed the workflow is substantially different from what has been done before.
It seems like in the interest of the life, you know, everything has a timeline, a life cycle. It also allows things to clean up after themselves as well. So we don't have all these stale rules in our firewalls anymore.
Right. I mean, that's actually a good point that I didn't emphasize. I mean, you can have a central place where you're managing the security policy to access service X. Because that's kind of the meta origin of a bunch of these ACL rules, right? And then if those ACL rules go away, they disappear. I was talking to, you know, an application hosting provider, whatever you call it, people that provide host applications to others, call it SaaS providers, something. The other day, and they were telling me, you know, it's like, oh, our biggest problem is figuring out what are the ACL rules there, why the ACL rules are there, and can we clean them up? Are they seeing any traffic? Right. So another way to manage these ACL rules is instead of manually pushing those ACL rules to the user, define them with the service. And if you define them with the service, hopefully, for instance, if the user no longer uses that service, well, the rules go immediately away. Let me give it a shot, see if I can go through the entire workflow of creating a test environment for Redmine. So I'm logged in as OpenStack admin. So let's start by creating a new project, and let's call this Redmine-staging, because we would be staging the next version of the application. And we just go create a project. I'm going to decide that I am an admin of that project too. I was an admin of Redmine, so it kind of makes my life simple to be able to admin both my, the previous version of the project and my new project. And the data center admin is a good guy, so I let him administer my project. So I'm going to do this. I want to deploy this Redmine staging app. So let's go to steps. Here I'm going to go to networks, and I'm going to create a network under the Redmine staging project. So I could have done this from Neutron also. So this time I'm not going to call it default, because in my reporting, default kind of looks a little bit bad. So I'm going to use IP address management, and I'm going to say that I want to go with 40/24 as the subnet on this staging environment. Blah blah blah. This looks good. So I created a network, staging network. And now let's assume that I am project Redmine staging. I'm going to just take my Redmine instance and launch a copy. So staging-1, let me give it enough memory and disk. Boot from image. This guy has a password, and I'm going to localize it in the staging network. So at this point, my instance is booting up. The way these guys, the way this image is defined, is going to ask me for kind of a new root password when it first comes out. So I'm just going to create a new root password. And it's kind of insistent on this password business. As you can see, this is just a turnkey app that I just got out of the internet just to take a workflow example. So at this point, I went to just through the VNC console to do the initial setup, but I have zero network connectivity to this guy. It's living off on an isolated network. Now, if I find one of my screens, I will jump into my management server. So this is the server running both OpenStack, one of the two redundant servers running OpenStack and OpenControl. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to want to access those different services. I have a simple script that can add access between my network and a specific policy. Before that, let me just edit my credentials. So the way that this OpenStack tends to work is you have a file with your credentials, and you say which project. As a user, you have privileges in different projects, but really what matters is for the operation is which tenant you're operating under. So I'm going to do network policy add, how did I call this guy? Redmine-staging. No, I don't need that because I'm already Redmine staging. I call the network staging, right? Now, I'm going to go and look at my catalog of policies. So
the point is, you build a front end, you build a middleware, you build a back database at the back, and you're pumping the flows between them. And in one case, you're bypassing the firewall, and you're showing the metadata of the policy end to end using the Contrail product. That's
so really, there's only one case where I was going through the firewall.
Yeah. That's right.
Which was the case where with the Redmine app, and that was just because I selected it in the policy, because otherwise I wouldn't go through the firewall.
So I mean, part of this was sliced, and we could have access in limited manners, and I guess my question is, could we have automated the entire process to eliminate the human error with the OpenContrails product?
Yes, I mean, typically the way you do it is you anything I did in UI is also available and can be done better in with a Python script, right? So
we could change the configuration files and everything, all the configuration files that we needed to change to access the database's staging, and we could actually make this more of a self-service.
Yes, I mean, typically this would be deployed by scripts. So it's not so much configuration, but it's using a REST API to modify the state. The same way, well, I mean, the same way when you typically work with OpenStack, you have the Horizon UI, but to do any serious deployment, you actually use either a bunch of scripts that they use the command line interface, or a bunch of scripts that actually go directly to the Nova and Neutron APIs. So it's sort of the same workflow. You'd complement some of the Neutron calls with a command line script, or you just use the Python APIs directly, but nobody deploys anything in production using GUIs. The GUIs are just a way to show things. So I launch the VM here by clicking on things, but typically I would do a Nova boot command. I created the networks in UI. I would typically do Neutron network create. So that's the typical process that we see.
So you're saying nobody deploys things using a GUI?
Not in serious.
Not at any scale.
I mean, everything that you do in a
But isn't
in a
that
serious
some of the
shop.
direction that we're trying to take?
No, I think if you're, at least my understanding, right? If you're really deploying production applications, you have a script. That script is checked into revision control. You want to deploy an environment, you run that script.
You want automation, right? And that's where that scripting comes into play. So I think the takeaway from the network piece of that is it looks to me like Contrail is doing all the network heavy lifting on the back end of this, right? So anything that has to be funneled around, tunneled around, however you want to call it, is now handled by OpenContrail. So that leads me to my question of how does that interact with how OpenStack was built before you put OpenContrail in there? Does that remove?
We're just a Neutron plugin.
Okay.
So we're a Neutron plugin, and sort of the network policy mechanism I was showing you is an extension to Neutron.
Okay.
So you can access. So Neutron allows for API extension. So we implement all the basic Neutron APIs, and in addition, we added APIs that simplify the management of network policies and how you can now access multiple services and have the ACLs being automatically generated for you and being managed by different operational groups. So that's but it, you know, you can use, to give you an example, I can, having the credentials, if I use Neutron netlist, I should see my staging network. Actually, at the moment, since I have lots of privileges in this user, I see a bunch of networks, right? So this is a Neutron command that sees all the information that I created using the Contrail UI. So it's fully integrated with this is fully integrated with OpenStack, and you can use all the existing OpenStack APIs. So this was the Neutron port list command. You can see all the ports that are associated with all the virtual machines that I have running in this setup.
So you had mentioned like nobody uses a GUI, but couldn't you just take a web framework and then make calls against
you
your
can
backend
so
product?
our GUI actually only uses the REST API. I said people don't use a GUI to deploy production apps, right? Because there's the requirement, for instance, to make it auditable and repeatable.
Yeah.
To make it repeatable, you want something in a revision control system.
Sure. Which you could still integrate in with a web framework.
The web framework is very useful to display information, right? And whatever I did in our GUI, this GUI just calls the same REST API that a script would.
Okay.
Right? And the same thing with Horizon. I mean, Horizon...
Yeah, I'm not denying the back end, but I'm talking about when it comes to presenting the data and presenting the framework for somebody to use your back end. Like this whole demo you could have put into a web framework and kind of clicked a couple of buttons and shown us what happened on the back end.
So there are tools. I think what you're going at is application lifecycle management tools, and there's a bunch of tools out there. There's Heat, which is the OpenStack component that does exactly what you mentioned, which is layered on top of all these APIs. There are commercial products like Scalar, and some other one that totally escapes my mind at the moment. But there's several commercial products that do exactly that. RightScale, right? So yes, indeed, and they can use these same APIs.
Okay.
I just didn't build this demo using, for instance, Heat. But I've seen some of our customers actually use Heat on top of our product.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I think what we don't want is to be bouncing all over the place, because I mean I've got tools. Sometimes I'm in a GUI. I have to bounce out of the GUI to do something else because it's best to do it by command line. I have to bounce back to the GUI because it's easier to add a remark or something from the GUI. You know, being able to go to one place. But I do totally agree when you hit the submit button that exactly what it's doing. You know, whether or not it has to be approved through a change control process or not, that's the auditable evidence that needs to be logged somewhere.
I want to throw something out here too. I've been really kind of lost in the whole process, and I understand it's a demo. You know, I'm not going to hold that against anybody. I've been there, done that. I think from what we're seeing on Twitter, what I feel, what some of the other delegates have said, we don't really understand the differentiation of Contrail and Open Daylight. We don't really understand the problem you guys are trying to solve and where it fits into the overall architecture. I know based on the agenda you're like done, but if we get a few free minutes or there's some sort of, you know, buffer that we can build into this, I could really care less about this right now. And I would really like you guys, if there's a chance today, to wrap that up, and if not, point us, the delegates, and everybody following along back to a resource that helps us understand what you're trying to accomplish.
I think we can. So if you step back, the demo I showed you, in my view, meets the real problem that a lot of application providers have, and I don't think there's any other product out there that addresses that problem. which is essentially how do you coordinate and how do you speed up the deployment of new application environments. So it not only you need to have the bare bones sort of network functionality, you need to meet the workflow of what people are trying to do. So I think from what's our value add? Our value add is trying to meet the requirements of people that manage and people that serve applications. And I think we do it better than others out there. And my demo was centered around what we've seen from some of our customers that their needs are in terms of workflow.
Well, if I take that away, and I think I'm wrong here, I think I'm hyper oversimplifying your statement, but if I take away what you just said, you're saying that Contrail is a workflow engine for networking processes inside all these other automation tools. And I don't think that's it, but that's what I just took away from the statement.
No, I think Contrail is a network virtualization solution that fits in with the workflow needs of complex application environments. So it does all the network virtualization functions that other offerings would do, but we do believe it fits better into what network management requirements are. And again, this is not a workflow tool. You would use something like Heat on top of these as a workflow tool. But I think the building blocks do match what the needs of, for instance, a SaaS provider are. And I think we're the product in the market that really hits that use case correctly. And we are seeing a fair amount of traction with the people that do have have workflows that are sort of built this way.